Home is where our stories begin. Our Town, Our Kids works with local Kansas communities to reduce the number of their youth at risk for involvement in the juvenile justice system. Hi, welcome to Quick Start Juvenile Justice Reform. I'm Sue Williams, Project Director for Our Town, Our Kids, and I'll be your tour guide today, so to speak, as we go through issues related to juvenile justice reform. Today we're going to look at three main ideas. First of all, reform is process. Secondly, using Kansas as an example, we're going to examine the law of the land today, and that is Senate Bill 367. And then we're going to have updates, questions, and concerns that may arise as you talk or listen to people in the field concerned with the implementation. As we might expect, reform is never a straightforward process, and it never happens overnight, right? First of all, it's a complicated process. It involves the state and government and laws and legalese. Secondly, it also involves community-based prevention, intermediate interventions, and graduated sanctions. Finally, it also includes the juvenile correctional facilities, which is the sort of deep end of the system, if you will, for kids. Here's a timeline over the past 25 years of reform efforts in Kansas, using this as an example. Prior to 1995, both SINCs, that is, Child in Need of Care, and juvenile offenders were under the same umbrella, and that was the Kansas Department of Social and Rehabilitative Services, or SRS. In 1995, with the enactment of SB312, the Juvenile Justice Authority was created to manage the juvenile offender part of youth involvement in the system. This included kids between the age of 10 and 17 who had committed either a delinquent act or a status offense. The Juvenile Justice Reform Act of 1996 addressed the security, the intake and assessment, the building of secure facilities at the time, parental involvement, and transition plans, just as a few examples. In 1997, the Kansas Advisory Group was created as an advisory board to the governor. It still operates today, and at that time, SB69 also sought to maximize community-based placements. A major concern, though, in splitting up the SINCs and the JOs at the time and since then has been the determination of where a child belongs in the system. As you might imagine, for a minute, even maybe if you haven't had a lot of background in this area, very often we're talking about the same kid. As a matter of fact, almost all of the kids who are in a juvenile correctional facility have experienced trauma of some kind in their lifetime. So it's a complicated process. To demonstrate the radical change that came with the creation of the Juvenile Justice Authority, here are a couple of illustrations I wanted to talk to you for just a minute. On the left is the image of sort of a cottage-like structure that represented the most secure facility for kids during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in Kansas. It was a residential treatment center known as YCAT, stood for Youth Center at Topeka. Many veteran professionals today that you might hear talking about maybe the good old days, or maybe not the so good old days, will recall YCAT, and they all have stories to tell about it. For many years, there was not even a fence around it. Later on, they did erect a fence. But in the early days, when a child tried to run, so to speak, the staff would gather together and literally run through the wooded areas in the nearby acreage to find the kid and bring him or her back. I heard many of these kinds of stories, often told through sort of a sense of nostalgia, if you will. So in 1997, when responsibility was transferred from the Department of Social and Rehabilitative Services, SRS, to the Juvenile Justice Authority, construction of a new facility for youth was designed, and it was under the designed after the adult system. You will see the aerial view of the results of that facility construction on the top right up there. So you can see it's quite a massive conglomeration of buildings and fences and so forth. It's a very secure fence and is really based on adult prison-like features. It opened in August 2004, and it's actually on the same acreage as YCAT was located at the time. On the lower right, you see what a typical juvenile's room might look like today. The only one of these that is an actual picture of the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex, which is what the new facility is called, is the upper right hand. The others are just photos that I know from experience, mirror what the system looked like back then and what the rooms might look like today. So Juvenile Justice Authority, which began in 1997, was then merged with the Kansas Department of Corrections. Originally, it was a standalone entity that had its own governance, and then the governor at the time merged it within KDOC in July 2013 to quote-unquote, increase internal effectiveness and provide more secure operations. Since then, other juvenile facilities in Kansas have closed, and this one remains the only one in the state of Kansas for juvenile incarcerated youth in Kansas, including both boys and girls. So, August 2004, remember that's when the new complex was completed. There's a disclaimer here as well. I don't know who the subjects in this photo are, but it's reminiscent of what I saw in 2004. I was interviewing incarcerated boys at the time at YCAT, a very different kind of research project then, and I was there during the transition from YCAT to the new facility. One day, as I was in the third story of one of the buildings there where I was doing the interviewing, I looked out the window and this is what I saw. One boy, probably about 13, very slight, probably didn't weigh more than 100 pounds, was in an orange jumpsuit, very much just like this one. His hands were cuffed behind him. His feet were in shackles chained to his waist. A uniformed officer was on each side of him, holding him by the arms. Another uniformed officer walked behind him, and the superintendent of the facility in suit and tie, it's the equivalent of a warden, walked in front of him. So I stared as these four men walked this child probably about 100 yards from YCAT to the new correctional complex. For me, the scene was symbolic of the transition from YCAT, a youth treatment center, to the current institutional setting that is a prison that we seldom call a prison. But that is our facility today, and that's what we work with. So, continuing our timeline, here you see that some of the precursors to our current rule of law, known as SB367, began in 2013. The then governor, as you might recall, abolished the Juvenile Justice Authority and transferred the jurisdiction to the Kansas Department of Corrections. In 2014 and 15, various House bills restricted prosecution and placement practices. The newly formed Juvenile Justice Work Group began working with the Pew Foundation and developed recommendations for data-driven policies. And then in 2016, the legislature passed SB 367, a sweeping reform that you will hear much about while you're out and about and in the field in working with juvenile justice professionals, or with just about any mention of juvenile justice in Kansas. Maybe you've already heard much about it. This headline encapsulates the main thrust of SB 367, to work toward decarceration of youth. Why now? And you might hear this refrain as well from those who were around during the 1996 juvenile justice reform. You might hear people say, but we did that back then. So we're going to look a little bit at some facts and some statistics and some elements that urged the lawmakers to take further steps. Basically, there were at least 3 different umbrellas of problems that I will go over with you. I want to thank the organization Kansas United for Youth Justice for this summary, because I thought they did such a good job that I wanted to borrow it from them. And if you will see their logo down in the bottom right corner there, and I will provide a link to their website so that you can look at other material that they have. First of all, the system that we were working within was quite ineffective. Here's some examples. 54% of Kansas youth sent to out-of-home placements were not successfully discharged. 42% sent to a juvenile correctional facility were incarcerated again within 3 years of release. 80% of out-of-home placements were low to medium risk. Now, what this means is they were overplaced, they were over-restricted, which means they were placed in an environment needlessly, inappropriately, that was deleterious to their health and development. All of this increases the risk of reoffense. Secondly, the system was working inconsistently. First of all, there's justice by geography, meaning that different areas in Kansas were governed in different ways because of the rural nature of our state and our region. There are areas that were not able to take advantage of some of the system advantages, so to speak. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Very often the results, the outcomes were disproportionate by minority status, with minority kids getting sort of the rough end of the deal in some cases. 25% of those that were convicted of misdemeanors only, and yet they were treated again with very severe restrictions. And supervision of those activities also lacked uniformity. Third, the system was unsustainable. And I think this is when it really came to the attention of the lawmakers that they had to move at that time. More than 2/3 of the total juvenile justice budget was being spent on juvenile prisons and out-of-home placements. Less than 1% was committed to evidence-based community rehabilitation programs. This one is staggering. It takes almost $100,000 to keep one youth for 1 year in a juvenile correctional facility. By comparison, it takes $50,000 in residential treatment facility and $5,000 for community supervision. So some stark differences there, right? So let's take a little closer look now at SB 367 and some of the elements that you might be interested in. First of all, for juveniles in custody, it narrows the authorities and conditions and requires training for professionals who are involved at all levels. It also encourages immediate intervention in community-based programs. It requires intervention, some juvenile rights, community-based alternatives to formal charges, and requires consultation in many instances with the Supreme Court of Kansas. It requires risk-need assessment and strict standards for detention for different placements, and requires a case plan and transitional programs. It limits the extended prosecution to adult court for the most serious offenses and raises the age from 12 to 14. At one time it was 10. The implementation establishes a 19-member Kansas Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee. This includes training for professionals, including judges, county attorneys, district attorneys, defense attorneys. It requires the Attorney General of Kansas to collaborate with law enforcement and with Kansas State Board of Education. As you might note, these came from the Kansas Legislator Briefing Book 2017, and again, I will furnish a handout for you so that you can refer to this further. I thought it would be interesting to look at some of the key language in SB367. Here are some excerpts. The court shall not order removal of a child from a parent's custody without assessment and probable cause. No youth shall be placed in a juvenile detention center solely due to, and then it lists several conditions. Community-based alternatives to detention shall include, but not be limited to, so there are strict requirements there. The court must receive a post-adjudication and a predisposition risk needs assessment, and it spells that out. Dispositions must run concurrently. And juvenile court jurisdiction terminates under certain conditions, and jurisdiction may not be extended. So here, I bring this to your attention because these excerpts illustrate the teeth inserted into the law in this case. This chart summarizes a grid limiting the length of disposition at various levels of offenses. The next one does the same with probation limits. And again, I will provide a lot of these materials for you to review. Much of what you see here, again, was put together by the National Juvenile Defender Center. Some key changes, and this came from the Kansas, again, from the National Juvenile Defender Center, but also changes from sort of a practical guide that Kansas has put out for this. So there was sentencing alternatives that included placement with parents. It included probation, includes detention limits. Now, youth can get earned credit for each month of compliance, and also earned credit for what they term substantial compliance. So it puts some carrots in there instead of all sticks, right? It has some incentives built in. It limits the use of technical violations, provides consistent system for graduated responses. It limits probation revocation. These are all termed probation graduated responses so that it better fits the kid and the situation at the time. There are reintegration plans for youth placed outside the home, and those have to happen immediately. The court may only commit a youth to a juvenile correctional facility if the court finds either significant risk of harm or a firearm felony, and these are spelled out again in some of those charts that I gave you earlier, showed you earlier. It also defines a lot of other kinds of terms and conditions, such as conditional release, chronic offenders, departure sentences, alternative means of adjudication, juvenile fines and fees, and terms for status offenses. So finally, this placement matrix defines the category of offenses in terms of commitment modified by SB 367. So what you see on the top line is violent offenders 1, which is the most serious, and it's called for an off-grid felony with a minimum commitment term of 60 months. That is the most serious, and it goes down from there. For example, here you have serious offenders 3, and in this category, the child may be committed only to a correctional facility only if such offenders are assessed at high risk on a risk needs assessment. Chronic offenders, same thing, only if they're assessed as high risk on a very elaborate risk needs assessment. Firearm felony will allow the commitment of a youth, but it's not required to do so, as was the case in the past. Okay, so that was a brief overview. I want to give you a few updates now with some other issues that may come up in terms of questions and concerns. First of all, since SB 367, Kansas has experienced a 63% decline in youth confinement, and that has been just from 2016 to 2018. Secondly, there's been a 29% drop in juvenile arrests. This is really interesting because it shows that different kinds of reforms can take different forms of outcomes as well, and they can happen concurrently. $30 million has been shifted for evidence-based programs from some of the savings that has come as a result of these declines. 63 to 88%, depending on the program, of youth in evidence-based programs completed it successfully. And 99 of the 105 Kansas counties now operate immediate intervention programs, a real landmark for the SB 367. And according to 88 of the reporting communities that reported data in 2018, 89% of their youth had successfully completed the IIP programs. All of these are outstanding marks of change, and rather rapid change, as a matter of fact. This is just a graphical representation of the reducement in residential placements from 2015 to 2018. So there are questions and concerns. Let's talk about just a few of them. Reforms over this period of time is supposed to yield 72 million. These are savings that happen from these reductions in secure confinements. And these are supposed to be used for reinvestment in evidence-based programs. It's unclear, though, how these funds will be used. How can local communities coordinate with state officials? This is a real challenge, and one that we're certainly looking at closely. Here's a really big one. Service gaps and funding needs remain unanswered. We just don't know yet. They don't know yet exactly how to get to the communities who may need them most. Recently, there was a little glitch. The Kansas legislature reappropriated $6 million from the Evidence-Based Program Fund to the Department of Health and Environment. No one seems to know exactly why that happened, and there's some movement to try to get it returned. That's one example of how vigilance and oversight will be crucial to sustainability for the results of SB 367. So one of the concerns that we referred to earlier, you might remember, is this justice by geography. In this case, I'm reminded of what we in criminology encounter very often, and it's called urban ethnocentrism. That is, almost everything we know from research, from studies, from our scholarly work, from practice-based work, is based on facts, stats, and evidence gathered in urban areas. Now, I think we can all agree that the context, the circumstance, the situation, the culture, the practices in places like you see on the right-hand side of this screen may be starkly different from the same kinds of circumstances that we see in places like those on the left. So a one-size-fits-all does not necessarily work, especially for non-urban areas, and those especially in rural and isolated regions of the country. That's a huge concern and one that we're working on diligently here at OTOK. So this brings us to OTOK and our partner sites. So you might see over in the left-hand side of the screen, we have two partner sites out there. First is what we call the super district, and that's the combined judicial districts of 15, 17, and 23. So that's a very large area over in the northwest part of Kansas. This is probably the most rural area of Kansas. And this is by the way, this is a population density map that you might see. The other one that we're working with is the 25th Judicial District that includes Garden City, Finney County, and those surrounding counties down in that area. That also includes some very, very distinct rural areas. So just as some examples, the average population density for Kansas overall is 35.6. That is 35.6 people per square mile. Riley County, where I'm located with K-State, for an example, is 121. Sedgwick County is 515, and Wyandotte is 1,080. So there's quite a disparity there. By comparison, we have Wallace and Greeley County over in the westernmost part of the state with 1.6 and 1.7 respectively persons per square mile. So it again stands to reason that we have to acknowledge the differences in place. Place matters. Throughout my years of research, I've actually been a professor and researcher for about 30 years now. And all of those years, I know throughout all of my research that place matters. That's one of my centering mandates that I come back to over and over. Place is a container, and it matters. Oh, by the way, up in that combined super district that I was telling you about, 15, 17, and 23, the administrator up there of that combined district covers 16,000 square miles. 16,000 square miles. So can you imagine sort of getting around weekly to your jurisdiction up there? Quite a feat. So now imagine for a minute that over in St. Francis, way up in northwest Kansas, needs to provide treatment to one of their kids. Overwhelmingly, they will probably not be able to find a service provider in their area. This is due to a number of reasons, including the population density, but there's just not enough kids up there to warrant an office or sometimes not even a traveling provider up in that area. Further, SB367 requires that certain evidence-based programs be used in order to get that funding. And those programs' fidelity, that is the requirement, the rigors with which they are proven to be effective and therefore are required and instructive, also may require that something like, well, 2 professionals have to be in the room and they have to be trained in this and this way. And you have to have at least 6 to 10 youth in a group so that you have the group dynamics going on. So what can these professionals do? They very often are caught with in a real bind with a conundrum. So let me give you some examples here. So with 367, we might point out that from St. Francis, if you need to get a kid from St. Francis to Kansas City, that's 440 miles, 6 hours one way. If maybe there's a place in Wichita that would do the service for them, that's 360 miles each way and 5 hours to get there. So how are they going to transport? What about the families? Can the families get there? How can they participate? While it may be true that confinement was being used to obtain services in the past, SB 367, and rightly so, restricts that kind of practice of locking kids up. But what is in its place? What remains in place for rural areas? These are just a couple of the dilemmas that you may hear about in the field, so to speak, as very well-intended people grapple with these conundrums. There are no easy answers, but we in OTOK are working closely with our partner sites. This is a pilot project, so we're working hand in hand to try to come up with reasonable solutions for our kids. In conclusion, SB 367 grew from problem recognition and concern. The first thing we have to do is acknowledge the problem, and this was done. SB 367 has seriously curtailed out-of-home placement for youth, and we've seen evidence of that in a 63% drop in a very short amount of time. SB 367 enactment is saving significant state dollars. Reinvestment funds and sustainability, however, remain uncertain. Justice by geography remains a serious concern. But we here at OTOK and our partner sites hold great potential to problem solve. That's our job. And finally, thank you for your time and attention, for your interest in our kids. And if there's one thing I know, it takes a village. Bye-bye. Our Town, Our Kids is a pilot project funded through the Kansas Department of Corrections, Kansas Advisory Group, and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The university group is K-State Juvenile Justice Collaborative, a multidisciplinary team from Kansas State University, Fort Hays State University, and K-State Extension. Ultimately, Our Town, Our Kids aims to empower local communities with a scalable, comprehensive set of tools which will stand as an exemplar to other counties across Kansas and beyond. For more information, please go to our website at ourtownourkids.org or reach out to us directly with questions, concerns, and feedback. Thank you for your time and attention.